Hey, everybody. So I get asked a question pretty often that I want to answer today. And I'm going to answer the question this time by going to a single Bible passage, one that's come to summarize my approach to politics more than I think any other passage right now. So here's the question, first of all. People ask me, if it weren't for Donald Trump himself, would you be open to the rest of what the GOP and the MAGA movement are selling? And I get asked this question by people who know my story, people who know that I was a conservative Republican my whole life until the Republicans tried to give me Donald Trump in 2016. And they know that I worked for years in the pro-life movement before I went into ministry. And then I spent 20 years as an evangelical pastor, again, up until 2016. And so these people have watched me try for years to convince Christians to finally reject the MAGA movement. So people who know all of that about me oftentimes will ask something like, okay, but leaving Trump out of it, would you agree with what the GOP and the MAGA movement are trying to do, like otherwise? And that question gets at something really important. If what they're asking me is basically, do I think the Republican Party would go back to being the party I used to support once Trump is gone? The answer to that is no. I think that pretty obviously that party is never coming back. And I wish some people who still vote for it would realize it's never coming back. But here's the interesting question for me. Have I changed in some way that caused me to rethink my assumptions about politics? And that's the question I'll answer now. And the answer is yes. Yes, very clearly yes. So for most of my life, until 2016, I viewed my political involvement mostly through the lens of my Christian faith. And I still do, but it's very different now. But that is the first thing I want to say. I viewed it through the lens of Christian faith. The second thing is that the way I interpreted it back then, the way that I understood what it meant to think about politics through the lens of Christian faith, was in trying to push for laws around a few key moral issues mainly. And honestly, I never liked that framework. The only issue that I personally worked on, like I've mentioned, was pro-life. And I've talked many times about my views on that, and you can find them on my YouTube channel. But I voted for candidates who were selling the whole package, the whole, Christian right, moral package. So on some level, I did used to think that the Republican Party was the more moral party, the more Christian party. And I feel dirty even saying that right now. But there you go. That's what I believed. And I know millions of people still believe that. So on that one level, Donald Trump actually forced me to rethink all of this. When Trump won in 2016, I saw how people like Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio and a lot more, people who'd been some of his biggest critics just turned on a dime and became his biggest supporters, his biggest sycophants, I would say. And I saw thousands of supposedly Christian leaders bending the knee to Donald Trump. So on a very profound level, Trump woke me up to the rot inside that whole sick marriage between the religious right and the Republican Party. So I've had to rethink everything. And I do think I'm in a better place now. Otherwise, I guess I wouldn't be here. But I'm going to share a verse that summarizes my new approach to politics as a Christian. And I think this verse destroys this gross pseudo-Christian approach to politics that the MAGA movement is pumping out all the time. But I think it also undermines my old view of politics. The passage is James 1:27, and it says, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." Now, I'm sure a lot of my listeners are going to hear me say this, and you might immediately think that I'm using it to promote what you might call a social gospel, because it has been used that way. And I would say it has been used almost as the reverse of what I'm coming against here. I'm coming against Christians who think that they're called to impose their faith on the world through laws and to force the nation to live by supposedly Christian moral norms around just a few hot-button cultural issues. What I'm not saying is that this passage forces Christians to adopt a certain form of government or a certain economic system that's more geared toward care for the widow and the orphan. That would be, I think, if I went that far with it, that would be to make the opposite mistake that too many Christians make on the morality side of things. But this passage does entirely rule out the priorities of the MAGA movement. It just completely undoes everything that the MAGA movement is about. It rules out all the messaging that they use around moral issues in order to seize power. And I know that if we're paying attention, we already know the hypocrisy of the MAGA pseudo-Christians speaking out on issues of supposed personal morality, because they support some of the sleaziest politicians our nation has ever known. So granted, that's true, and it ought to be humiliating, by the way, to any Christian who's part of that movement. But this video isn't about hypocrisy. I make other ones like that. This one is about the whole approach to faith in politics. Now, if you've listened to me for a while, you'll know that I tend to really despise this whole concept of proof texting scripture, and it might look like that's what I'm doing here. I can't stand the way that people will take one passage out of context and build a whole theology around it. And I see this all the time in what I call the pseudo-Christian MAGA movement. Romans 13:1 is one of their favorites, and at least one person throws that at me every day in my YouTube comments. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. I've spoken before about how this verse gets abused by authoritarian-minded religious people who use it as a hammer to defend all kinds of authoritarian abuse, both in their churches and in their politics. And so I see that verse and many others taken out of context. And I'm sure I'll talk about it again many times. But I want to show you what I'm getting from this passage in James. But I want you to know it's not out of context of what it means to be a Christian in the world. And it perfectly summarizes the whole book of James. So, like I said, it's not a proof text to say Christians must vote for a certain economic policy or approach. That would be as wrong as the way people misuse Romans 13:1. This passage is all about our orientation toward God and how we express that in the world. And when I say this next thing, I really want you to hear me as somebody who's changed my views. I didn't go to Scripture to support my approach. I came upon passages like this that I had read many times in my life, and they started to hit me different. And I started to be challenged. They challenged my approach, and I wrestled with them. So I just want you to know that I believe this next thing that I'm going to say to my core, even if it sounds harsh. But the entire book of James, if a person reads it honestly, I think would make them ashamed of ever having been part of the MAGA movement. It's just in such stark contrast, the way that Christians are told to live in James and the way that the entire MAGA movement operates. It's not a voting guide, but it's a description of how to live as a Christian in the world. And I honestly don't know how a Trump supporter can read the book of James and come away unashamed. If you can pull that off, I'd like to hear how you can pull that off. So I think if a person claims to be in a movement that's acting out of religious principles, then it might be good to ask, well, what does God consider good religious principles? So what does this passage say again? It says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Okay, I mean, it's hard to get more explicit than that. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this. And that perks my ears up. If I want to view politics through the lens of faith, then here we go. Look after orphans and widows in their distress. I mean, wow, that some people would say that sounds kind of woke. But again, I'm not going to do the dishonest thing and say that this proves we have to have a certain economic approach, but it does say this needs to be first and foremost in our religious duties. So, by the way, I don't mind the word woke. I'm using that as, to be sarcastic. But if you look at similar Bible passages, you'll see when we're being told to care for orphans and widows tend to be shorthand for a larger category of people. So look at Deuteronomy 10:18. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. Or Zechariah 7:9-10. This is what the Lord Almighty said: administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. In Isaiah 1:17, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. And I think we get the picture. I mean, I could list many more. But the point is, if we're talking about religion, the kind of religion that God the Father accepts, according to James, is to care for the poor, the marginalized, the immigrant, the oppressed, and yes, the orphan and the widow. There's no loophole in Scripture that's big enough to get us out of that basic understanding of what the shape of our lives ought to be. And I know there's a second part to the verse. I'm going to get to that because it makes my point even clearer. But first, let me say this. If a person says to me, I don't believe my personal religion ought to have anything to do with my politics, then I'd say, sure, okay, I accept that. Whether that's an atheist or a person of faith who wants to keep those things separate, I'd say that's a defensible position. I mean, I would wonder how they actually pull that off, separating their belief system from the choices they make, but I would accept it as a coherent approach. What's incoherent and what's, I'd even say, diabolical is for millions of people to call themselves Christians and to explicitly say that they're voting as Christians, but then to reject the most important thing God tells them explicitly to do as Christians. If you're involved in politics for religious reasons, God tells you what your religious priorities are. Care for the orphan and the widow. And amazingly, as it turns out, that's the sort of thing governments can actually do. Governments are one of the ways societies come together to accomplish things that the people believe are worth doing. And they're far from perfect, but governments do have some capabilities for caring for the poor and the oppressed that individuals just don't have. And again, the way we choose to do that as a nation is not prescribed in the Bible. But the priority for the poor is everywhere in Scripture. And to take it a step further, it's not just about caring for physical needs. The MAGA movement's cruelty toward immigrants and anyone else that they define as the other, I can only call that an abomination. There's no excuse as a Christian for participating in a movement that uses dehumanizing rhetoric against human beings and glorifies their mistreatment at the hands of masked government agents. So there's that. But what about that second part of the passage? Keep oneself from being polluted by the world. I mean, how much clearer could that be? Keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Keep oneself. MAGA pseudo-Christians get all of this stuff backwards. They claim to be acting as Christians in their politics, but they reject the clear commands of Scripture about how to be a Christian, to care for the poor and the oppressed, and they even delight in acts of cruelty to the stranger among us. But when it comes to the thing that we're told to do ourselves, to keep ourselves from being polluted by the world, they try to weaponize that against anyone who commits the sins that they've decided are the big ones. But if we think about lying or cruelty, abuse, demonization, selfishness, greed, gluttony, pride, envy, wrath, all of those are fine, and they even reward politicians who glory in those sins. But they band together as a voting bloc to try to keep a small minority of people from polluting the nation in a few very specific ways. And meanwhile, they embrace the worldliest man any of us have seen as president, and they embrace the world's tactics, power over the other, dishonesty, cruelty, selfishness, and they call that Christian. And I just have to say, as ugly as all of that is, none of it's an accident. Christians who fall for this movement are really just pawns in someone else's game, and they're selling their birthright for a bowl of pottage. It's going to be worthless in the end. The people behind the MAGA movement, people like Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and many others, have learned to leverage worldly Christian grievances to get worldly Christians to fight worldly culture wars, instead of doing the hard work of living as an actual follower of Jesus in this world. So finally, I just want to say, if you're a part of the MAGA movement and you don't like it when I call you a pseudo-Christian, I suggest that you leave that pseudo-Christian movement, because whatever the MAGA movement is, it's not Christian. And its religion is nothing like the kind that God calls pure and faultless. So thanks for listening.